Good to have you with us. I'm Min Sanhee with yet another edition of Foreign Correspondents, and as always, joining me on set is our group of foreign journalists. Welcome to the show.
Good to be back, thanks.
It's your first time here at Atahualpa. Do tell us a bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Atahualpa Merise. I'm a correspondent for the news agency of Spain here in Seoul. And thank you very much for having me here. I'm very happy.
Thank you for being here with us. Now, there have been many events here and elsewhere around the world this week. What news was of particular interest to you, Frank?
Well, I've been covering the protests against the president here against Park Geun-hye. I was downtown on Saturday for another large gathering of about 500,000 people. I really enjoy doing camera work a lot, so I got a chance to shoot a lot of really interesting video, and I had some help from a local broadcaster, Chosun, that let me onto their platform on top of one of the buildings, and then they took a video of me climbing up onto the platform and shooting some video, and they played it in their newscast. And then the next day my wife mentioned to me that a friend of hers called her and saw me on Korean TV, so that I thought that was pretty funny and nice of them to help me out.
What about you, Lise?
Yeah, same thing. I mean, the interest from the States is the Park Geun-hye scandal. She made history this week by being the first sitting Korean president to have to face a criminal investigation. So there was a lot of interest in the States about that. Over in Japan, there was a major earthquake that triggered several tsunamis that we are still keeping an eye on now because it was off the east coast near Fukushima Prefecture.
Right, and that is a developing story, right? What about you?
Of course, yes, the Park Geun-hye issue, because it's it's on trend these days, and also things about North Korea. North Korea is giving always news for a wire service like the Spanish news agency, and the Spanish people are like very interested in what Kim Jong-un does and this kind of international politics. And yeah, that's basically what I've been covering, preparing some big features for the end of the year, like talking about what happened in Korea this year, and that's what I'm into these days.
Right. Following the result of America's presidential race, where Republican candidate Donald Trump won the ticket to the White House, having based many of his campaign pledges on the America First Foundation, a growing number of politicians worldwide who have been campaigning for national interests over those of international priorities are gaining a stronger base, support base that is, at home. We have details in this report.
Thank you.
After Donald Trump won the presidential election, one word has repeatedly been appearing in U.S. President Barack Obama's speeches: nationalism.
It's inevitable that some will seek a comfort in nationalism or tribe or ethnicity or sect.
And on November 15th in Greece, during his final European tour, the president warned against the rise of crude nationalism. His final message appears to be aimed at Trump's nationalist policies. Many pledges proposed by Trump during his campaign, including trade protectionism, building a wall on the U.S. Mexico border, and banning Muslims from entering the U.S., was centered on the idea of putting America first. This can also be interpreted as nationalism. Nationalism can be defined as a sentiment based on common cultural characteristics that binds a population and often produces a policy of national independence or separatism. But this definition has changed over the past years, and it's now widely accepted as meaning putting one's own nation first. It's a concept that's contrary to ideas such as the world being one and the integration of Europe, which represent globalization. Britain's withdrawal from the European Union, or Brexit, is a good example.
We have a terrible sense that something momentous has happened in the lives of our country and of the whole of the European Union, my friends.
With more people sharing the belief that the UK's EU membership fees and immigrants were weighing down the economy and the job market, over half of the population voted to leave the regional bloc. The slogan of Trump's America First and Brexit supporters' Britain First have similar roots, largely stemming from nationalist ideas.
Working together, we will begin the urgent task of rebuilding our nation and renewing the American dream.
As a rising nationalist wave gains momentum throughout the world, we sit down now to discuss the current state of public sentiment and what has led to these developments. Right, a frequent word in reports on Mr. Trump is nationalism. Do you agree, Frank?
Yes, certainly. I think he used nationalism to get himself elected. You know, I'm a kind of a basketball fan and a coach of the San Antonio Spurs, Popovich, said that he felt he couldn't believe anything Donald Trump said. And I think in terms of his use of nationalism to gain popularity, it was like populist nationalism that he used in order to become president of the United States. And I think that a lot of those voters that he took from blue-collar voters that would normally vote Democrat voted for him for that reason, for his use of nationalism and maybe a little bit anti-immigration and these types of policies that might ring true or be attracted to those people in blue-collar positions.
But as we're talking about sort of nationalism in other parts of the globe and then nationalism in the United States, we have to remember that America is unique in the world in that it is a nation of immigrants. And so if you're a nationalist in Korea, you are likely to be Korean by blood too. If you're a nationalist in the United States, the kind of nationalism we're talking about is a kind of ethnic nationalism favoring whites in America, which are soon to become the minority. So the nationalism in the US is also tied to an ethnicity, but it's a very divisive nationalism because it leaves out nearly half of the United States population, which are immigrants, sons and daughters of immigrants, grandchildren of immigrants, people that aren't tied to America as or American as a racial or ethnic identity, but rather only as the idea of America. And the idea of America has been constantly shifting to be more inclusive. This is a real blowback to that, a backlash to it that we're watching now in the US.
So I think in the case of Donald Trump, it's just a different kind of nationalism because America has been a strong nationalist country, always, you know. Every president appealed to the feelings of nationalism to the people.
Patriotism.
To get patriotism, nationalism, and the US flag just to win elections, to invade countries, to do bad and good things, you know. So in this case, Trump just appeals to that minority, and it's also an anti-establishment movement. And you know, so they just try to appeal to these feelings of these white people that feel a little bit offended for the things that have been happening in the last year, and they are against the establishment to just gain votes, and he was successful in that.
And then an ironic sort of part of that is that the white people in America are themselves immigrants. Only, you know, historically, maybe a couple hundred years ago initially, but it is an immigrant nation. So to have that type of nationalism of a country that was sort of appropriated from the indigenous population is really kind of hypocritical.
Right. Atahualpa, do you see Mr. Trump's presidential victory in the US as having a possible impact on the presidential elections in France and Germany next year?
Of course. I think, you have to see that Marine Le Pen was the first one in Europe to celebrate and congratulate Trump. And I think the National Front in France, they feel very empowered after the Trump victory, and they think that they can make it now. And they are using that wave to tell the people, look at it, we can make it too, we can make it here. We are nationalists, we tell the truth, and these other guys are telling you just things to get your votes, but we just care about the problems of the people, and they use that feelings against immigration. So it's a very dangerous thing, but of course they can send a wave to all Europe, and we will see in Austria. In Austria, in December 4th, there will be some the repetition of the elections because, that thing that happened, that there were only a few votes, so they were going to repeat the election. And probably the first far-right movement is gonna take a power in Europe. So that's something very dangerous in the old continent.
Elise, do you share these views?
I don't know Europe as well as Ata does, but there is certainly a concern that there's a ripple effect of this sort of thing. And it's largely, it makes sense, it makes logical sense. It's in response to a kind of globalism that has left out working class people all over the world, and refugees, immigrants have really come in huge numbers to parts of the Western world, and they also need to feed their families, and they also need to take jobs and get jobs and work. They're often willing to work at lower wages, others who have been in a country for longer, and so that's created a kind of competition. In those times of economic distress, you often sort of huddle right close to your people, and tribalism can take root. So this is something that we've seen throughout history. The issue now is that we're in a more dangerous world. There's a lot more nuclear weapons. There's a lot more ways to disrupt governments with cyber terrorism and things like that. So while the phenomenon is not new in history, in world history, the dangers are quite significant.
No one works around here and they don't pay well.
He's going to make changes, and he's going to make changes that are American focused so that we put America first.
Everybody's trying to get the economy back up. I mean, we need it badly.
We're on a downward slide, and we need to bring back prosperity, hope, that type of thing, and I think that Trump can do that. I really do believe he can do that.
Frank, speaking of the phenomenon not being new, what do you think is behind the current wind of nationalism?
Well, just to spin off of what Elise said, I think that what's going on now is kind of, in terms of its scale, it's a little bit different. And the motivations behind this nationalism, or the excuse that politicians can use to trump up support through nationalism, have really grown. The refugee crisis that is taking place in Europe right now is kind of fueling this nationalism. You've seen it increase in several countries, not just Austria, Hungary, the Netherlands, Greece, Denmark. Across Europe has seen a rise in nationalist political parties in the last few years. And it has, again, it's been fueled by this refugee crisis. Something like 2 million, some estimates say 2 million refugees came from the Middle East and North Africa into Europe just in 2015. 1 million of them documented. They're changing, they are kind of generating this trend and being used, again, by nationalist politicians to drum up support for their political parties and their run at government. If you look at the average of the number of immigrants that come in, it's about 260 per 100,000 in Europe. In countries that have more than that average, the countries that I mentioned, they have higher sort of support for nationalist political parties. So that is an influence in what's happening. It's not an excuse. I'm not trying in any way to justify that, but just to show how that is, again, being used by politicians and political parties to drum up support for their position.
And I would like to say that this nationalism in Europe, they are not something new, actually. We had it from some years ago, and they have a deepened root, I mean, the governments and the typical parties and the establishment, they fail to satisfy the needs of the citizen. First in economy, now we have a big unemployment rate. Second in foreign policy, because they participated in some wars in the Middle East which destabilized the area and made a lot of massive immigration to here. And third in the immigration policies, because many of the communities of immigrants, they came with nothing, and they made ghettos. They mix with the working class of the countries, and in some cases there are crimes and there are problems related to cultural shock. So those people in the neighborhoods who are living with immigrants and they are not happy with that, they turn to the nationalism and they turn to the right.
I think what we've seen in the United States and perhaps in Europe is a movement of left-wing governments to the center and to the right. Certainly in Great Britain, you could argue that the Labour Party has drifted to the right. In the United States, you could argue the Democratic Party has done the same thing. Otherwise, all of those people wouldn't have voted for Donald Trump. So the failure of the working class political parties has created sort of this problem, and a failure in their foreign policy. Short-sighted foreign policy in the Middle East has generated the crisis and wars that are taking place there, and we're seeing that also, of course, for a long period of time in sub-Saharan Africa as well, where the West really isn't making a concerted, long-range effort to encourage democracy to take root there. And so when those people try to escape their horrible situations that really don't have hope for the same type of lives that we have, I think we need to accept some of the blame there.
Now, there are various definitions for what constitutes a nation, and this has led to diverse strands of nationalism, with the more recent strand associating the term with populism and far-right political parties. We have more in this report. Nationalism is an ideology that sees the shared identity of its people as the foundation of the country. It has easily been combined with other ideologies in the past, reflecting the social atmosphere of the time. In the 21st century, ideologies often emerging along with nationalism have been far-right extremism and populism. Far-right extremism refers to radical right-wing thinking, right-wing people, and their factions. Populism can be defined as political ideas and activities that are intended to get the support of ordinary people by giving them what they want. Soon after Trump won the U.S. presidential election, right-wing European populist leaders were among the first to welcome his victory. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán congratulated Trump, saying that democracy is still alive. Frauke Petry, the chairwoman of Germany's Alternative für Deutschland, called Trump's victory a historic chance, while Jean-Marie Le Pen, the founder of France's Nationalist Front, wrote, "Today the United States, tomorrow France," on social media. Like Trump, the leaders of right-wing political parties in Europe are also hoping to win in upcoming elections next year.
Mon élection à la présidence de la République est présentée depuis des mois comme impossible, au peuple de le rendre possible.
Monsieur Trump veut défendre les intérêts des Américains, ça tombe bien. Moi, je veux défendre les intérêts de la France et de l'Europe.
Their expectations are no longer wishful thinking and could become a reality, as a nationalist wave has led to a surge in polls for far-right political parties. With many European nations expecting to hold their presidential or general elections next year, right-wing leaders appear to have a better chance at winning. Many of these parties have championed anti-immigration, anti-refugee, and anti-Muslim isolationist policies, rallying around nationalism and shaking up the European regional bloc.
When the boss of Europol says there are up to 5,000 jihadis who've come into Europe in the last 18 months, posing as migrants.
As these sentiments continue to draw public support, people around the world will have their eyes on whether it will lead to dramatic changes next year. Now, as we have just seen in the report, the voices of far-right political parties in Europe are gaining strength. Atahualpa, what is the actual political climate like in Europe?
Well, it depends on the countries. There are many differences. For example, in the Central Europe, I mean, if you count France and Germany and Austria and even in Scandinavia, the far-right movements are very strong, because they are receivers of immigrants, and they have some problems with the ghettos and things, and they have some politicians who took a very good advantage of the situation and appealed to the feelings of the working class and got them into to vote for them. So we have these fears of Austria turning to the far right and France. But in the case of Spain and Italy, for example, these new populist anti-establishment movements are more coming from the left. For example, in Italy, the party of Beppe Grillo, and in Spain we have this party called Podemos, and they are basically far left, and they propose like some more social policies, more state intervention, and they are just taking that anger of people, but just from the other side.
I think you make a really good point, because we saw the same thing from the left, from the Democrats as well. So during the Democratic primary between Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders was arguing for a populist, more socialist system that would better provide for a lot of people that are hurting, because his argument was that the Democratic Party, as it exists today in the United States, did not properly address those concerns. And I think that that makes sense. But what's different about the populism from the Republicans and from the Democrats right now is that the Democrats remain an inclusive party. This idea that everybody, working class isn't just white people, right? Working class is also Latinos. It's also, in fact, African Americans in the US have the highest rate of unemployment. And so that really the government needed to address everybody. The populism on the right is linked most closely with racism. And it's something that we don't talk about enough, I think, in the US, because there's a lot of sort of touchiness about it. But what is distinct from Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump's message is that Donald Trump's message played explicitly to blaming the problems of the working class in the US, defining the working class as white, and then blaming the problems on Muslims, on Mexicans, and on black people.
But anyway, I would never compare like Bernie Sanders with the far left movements in Europe, because the far left movements in Europe are more like basically communists. They are like really far left. They are very, they are in favor of Venezuela and Cuba and these kind of systems. So they are a little bit more dangerous than Bernie Sanders. I think Bernie Sanders
the American spectrum is farther, is actually quite narrow. Right?
I guess Bernie Sanders would be comparable to the social democrats in Europe who are having the government in many countries, right? Because we have social welfare and these kind of things in Europe, that Bernie Sanders is asking about that, right?
What Bernie Sanders talks about as being very extreme is actually just the status quo in most of Western Europe.
I think a Democrat would be a right wing in Europe.
The rise of nationalism, of course, is not just confined to Europe. It's also evident here in Asia. If I were to ask you about possible differences between these two forms of nationalism, so to speak, in Europe and in Asia, what would you point to?
We have had all this conversation without mentioning North Korea. North Korea is often cited as the reason for sort of what many people describe as the nanny state that governs Korea, censoring the internet and not allowing folks to reach North Korea or read about it. And this whole history textbooks debate that was going on in the past year, the idea that because South Korea is under threat constantly, that therefore we must treat our citizens as if they can't see all information. So that is incredibly linked to nationalism in the same way that the anti-Japan stuff is.
And good that you raised the issue of North Korea, because North Korea is probably one of the most nationalist countries in the world. It's crazy. When I was there in North Korea, I was talking to the people. There are some things like it's illegal to marry a foreigner, for example, in North Korea. They have to keep the pure blood. Even some women who had Chinese husbands in China and they come back, they are not well accepted. No, they want to keep the purity of blood, which is like a kind of an extreme nationalism.
Frank, do you see this current trend as being temporary or a permanent?
Well, I do hope it's temporary. Getting back to, I think, one of your earlier questions about the movement of this in Europe. One of the popular websites in the United States, a so-called alt-right website called Breitbart, for which somebody involved in the Trump transition team, Mr. Bannon, was involved with. They opened a website in the UK 2 years ago, a couple of years before Brexit. They want to open another website in France. So this movement of nationalism in Europe obviously is something that people think is going to continue.
Right. Well, it's time for us to wrap up the show now, but before we go, perhaps we can have a few final words, starting with Atta Walpa, because it was your first time on the show.
Well, I would like to say that in politics it's not good to appeal to feelings. You have to appeal to facts and try to solve the problems that the citizens have.
All right, Elise.
The key words, I think, for the United States and for all of its allies in the globe right now are anxiety and uncertainty. And we'll just have to see how the next few months and years ahead play out.
I think that the left-leaning governments or the liberal governments around the world need to do a better job of taking care of their middle class and the economic challenges that they face with globalization and develop more responsible foreign policies that can foster democracy in other places.
You're right, Frank, and we'll keep our fingers crossed for that. Before we leave today, here is some food for thought from Greek philosopher Plato, who once said, refusal to participate in politics is the reality that you end up being governed by your inferiors. On that note, we say goodbye. Thank you for watching.